This is the first meeting in 2015. I wish you all every success in the new year. Item 1 on the agenda, election of chairman. Any nomination? Mr. Andrew Leung. Any seconder? I accept the nomination. All right. Any other nomination? No? Thank you very much. I think this is very simple. I don't think we need to elect a deputy chairman. So please invite the representatives of the administration to come in.
Oh, 好啊，我哋都希望好快去，因為呢個相對簡單嘅嘢嚟嘅。
We'd also like to be quick because this is relatively simple. Thank you very much for attending. Let me introduce them. Ms. Jenny Lee, Acting Principal Assistant Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury for Financial Services. Ms. Joey Lam, Deputy Government Chief Information Officer. Mr. Esmond Lee, Executive Director for Financial Infrastructure from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And then at the back we have Mr. Jonathan Look from the Department of Justice. And then Mr. Dominic Kwong, Chief Systems Manager of the Commerce and Economic Development Bureau. And then Mr. Lee Shu Pui from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And Mr. Clarence Hui, Senior Manager of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. I'll defer to the Secretary, Ms. Joey Lam, to introduce the paper to us. Good afternoon. Happy New Year. As the development of electronic checks is developing very rapidly, and we'd like to launch e-checks, which is actually the electronic form of paper checks. To launch e-checks, we need to slightly amend the Electronic Transactions Ordinance. At the moment, in Schedule 1 of the Ordinance, a list of documents are set out because of their solemnity, significance, or complexity could not be in the electronic form insofar as legal status is concerned. To give e-checks a legal status, we need to delete checks from the schedule. But there are two types of checks, banks demand notes as well as cross checks. Such can be handled electronically, and that will be taken out. But cash checks cannot be in electronic forms insofar as processing is concerned. So if you look at the amendment, you see why we've included the word excluding, because we're only taking away negotiable instruments, that is, banks demand notes as well as cross checks. So e-checks will be your major concern. Now I'll defer to Mr. Lee from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority to give you an introduction. Good afternoon, Chairman and members. Happy New Year. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce electronic checks to you. At the end of the year, if we can launch electronic checks, Hong Kong will be the first city to use such checks. Apart from providing another form of payment for members of the public, we can also consolidate Hong Kong's status as an international financial center. For any financial center, payment avenues and tools as well as receipt tools and avenues are important aspects. So we need to advance with time. At the same time, in terms of avenues and tools of payment, safety and efficiency should also advance with time and would like to scale new heights. Let us look at this from the angle of members of the public. This is another tool of payment for the public. If you want to sign an e-check, a bank customer only needs to complete very simple procedures before they can use e-checks by using e-banking. If the recipient is using e-banking, it will be very easy. The e-check can be deposited into his account. Even if he is not using e-banking services, he can also, through the central depositing system, deposit the check into a designated bank account. Like paper checks, the recipient can request other persons like family members to deposit the check into the designated account. And e-checks are the same as paper checks. There's also a bearer, so you don't need to worry that the check will go into another account. It will go into the designated account. Will also enhance the formats of e-checks. The Hong Kong MA and the HCAP, that is the Hong Kong Association of Banks, will launch seminars, publish leaflets, and produce APIs to introduce the procedures and security measures for using e-checks to enhance public knowledge and confidence in the use of e-checks. Will particularly remind the payers, particularly enterprises, including big and small enterprises, to seek consent from the recipient and affirm the email address for receipt before issuing e-checks. Last year, on the 10th of November, at the ITB panel meeting, we're very grateful to members for their general support of the amendment to the ETO, such that we can have a perfect legal system for e-checks. We'd also like to thank members for endorsing the merits of e-checks. You've also made a very good suggestion, that is, the government should launch consumer education exercises to enhance the public knowledge on e-checks. We'll implement that suggestion and conduct more education activities to enhance public knowledge and use of e-checks. There's another concern, that is, can members of the public continue to use paper checks and other payment instruments? The answer is definitely in the affirmative. Members of the public can continue to use paper checks and other payment instruments. Here, we can look at the normal practice of using payment tools. These are very common ones. Very often, for the payers and the recipients, they can negotiate on the form of transaction. For example, a few friends after taking a meal can use checks for payments, and procurement of commodities by big and small enterprises also commonly use checks. And very often the recipient provides a lot of formats for payment. Like electricity bills can be paid by checks, e-forms, or be paid personally. And very often the payer will seek consent from the payee before choosing a particular payment avenue or tool. And on an IPO, for oversubscription, the residual amounts will have to be paid back to the investors. And almost without exception, the investor would be asked whether or not he would like to receive the residual amount in the form of a check or electronically. The distribution of dividends is the same. Very often the recipient is consulted on the form of payment. The use and implementation of e-checks are not to replace paper checks. therefore will definitely ensure that paper check services will continue. At the level of banks, they will continue to provide paper checks for the choice of consumers. At the level of the public, the Hong Kong MA and the HCAP will formulate guidelines and codes for the use of e-checks. It's only under the following circumstances that e-check should be issued. The payer has to seek the consent of the payee and to confirm the email address of the payee before issuing an e-check. Under special circumstances, if the payee, after receiving an e-check, refuses to accept the e-check can be cancelled by the payer, and the payer can ask the bank to cancel the e-check. That is known as stopping payment traditionally, and then the payment will be made in other forms and avenues. So I can firmly assure you that will ensure the continuation of the services of paper checks. What are the merits and convenience of e-checks? For the payer, including an enterprise or an individual, human resources can be saved by signing e-checks, and postage can also be saved. He does not need to personally deposit the check into the payee's account. And for the payee, be it an individual or an enterprise, he does not need to go to a branch of the bank to do depositing. And sometimes we write a check to ourselves. It's very common that you have the same name for the payer and the payee across banks. And very often, our bank account for our salaries is different from that for paying installments for our properties. So you need to send a check from one account to another under the same name. And e-checks will be most convenient in this case. But of course, you can give instructions to the bank to make the amount automatically. Anyway, e-checks will bring huge convenience to the public. Apart from payment avenues and tools being more convenient, e-checks can enhance Hong Kong's status as an international financial center. In this regard, we'd like to particularly thank LegCo members for their support. Payment avenues and tools have to advance with time, and the degree of security as well as efficiency must also be improved continuously. So thank you very much. So much for my introduction. Dr. Chung Lai Wan. Thank you, Chairman. I believe the e-checks will be more convenient. At least you don't need to post the checks. I mean, you don't need to deposit paper checks into a bank account. That's often the case now. Yet, I heard that Hong Kong is the first city to use e-checks. Yes, it's good for us to advance with time, but I believe many members of the public will be concerned about security. Conventionally, we're used to signing checks personally. So, when the person is there, the signature is there. So, how can we avoid security issues? We don't want members of the public to be too worried. So that's my first question for the time being. Thank you very much for the question. E-checks, when compared with conventional checks, are even safer. Let me give you an example. The traditional checkbook is issued to the customer in advance. And when a customer signs a check, the paying bank does not know that a check has been issued until the time when the check reaches the bank. But for e-checkbooks, they're basically in the record of banks. That is, when a customer issues a check, at that very moment, the paying bank already knows it. And then the manufacturing of such e-checks are using an encryption system such that data cannot be changed at all in the course of transmission. So when compared with conventional checks, e-checks are even safer. Traditional checks are already safe enough, but if you want to have a more sophisticated comparison, e-checks are even more safe because they are put under a public key infrastructure. So in terms of safety and efficiency, e-checks are better.
Hong Kong is a city which uses quite a great number of checks. So we think that Hong Kong is a city deemed appropriate for launching e-checks to provide more convenience to Hong Kong public and also enhance Hong Kong's status in an international financial center. It can help Hong Kong's financial industry in terms of our development. Dr. N. Chung. There are a number of cities in the world which are more advanced in terms of electronic tools and electronic payment. How come that these other cities are not using e-checks? Hong Kong is leading in many aspects. We are the first one to implement a lot of things. Now, how come that it is not used overseas? Well, there is e-transfer in many overseas cities. Say, for example, if I want to transfer the amount to Dr. N. Chung yourself, I have to get the details from you, like your bank account number and so on and so forth. The greatest advantage of e-check is that all I need to do is I just write your name on the e-check, and that's it. And then you can choose into which account you should deposit your check. How come that they are not using it? Well, because the system is not developed yet. Well, just like Octopus card, we are the first city in the world to use Octopus card, and many cities are following suit because of the good experience in Hong Kong. So we want very much to do the same with e-checks. Chairman, I'm very concerned. Is it because others are not using it, developing it, because of some security concerns? Would that be the case? With regard to security, e-checks should be very secure. Mr. Lee has also mentioned about the security issues and how it is very secure. For traditional paper checks, you need a signature. And for e-checks, you need also a digital signature. Mr. said that the public key will be used as the digital signature. So whenever you issue an e-check, you are doing it in an encrypted form. And that can prove that you have actually signed the check. Others are not doing it, maybe because they have not come up with the right system. So what I can say is that security should never be a concern. There are double security safeguards. First, you have to go into the e-banks and then sign the check. And then the second level of security is that you must use your encrypted signature to sign your check. And I think the security level in our system is very high. So, Chairman, thank you. I would like to talk about this perspective from the financial sector. How come that other cities are not using e-checks? First, checks are most commonly used in common law jurisdictions where English is used. So this is our observation. No. My question is not whether they are using it or not. My question is whether they are not using it because of security concerns. Now, I'll try to address your concern one by one. U.S. and Britain are the two countries which used most checks. They have studied into using e-checks, but they have met with opposition from the public. So the plan has been shelved. But in the future, they may revisit the idea. Another country, the U.S., they are not using it, not because of security concerns, but rather in the U.S., it takes several days before a check can be cashed. So the banks there have every incentive to try to delay the process of cashing the check. So these are the economic considerations, where they are not using it based on security concerns. But for Hong Kong, it's different. Well, the interest starts to count whenever check is issued. So we don't have the concerns as those in the U.S. and Britain. So different places have different considerations. Chairman, I would like to follow up. I will be quick. You said that in the UK there has been opposition from the members of the public. Why? Are they suggesting replacing paper checks together with e-checks altogether? Well, in the UK, there was suggestion, or the proposal was to cancel paper checks and to replace it with e-transfers. And they have not provided e-checks at all as an option. Now, 2 to 3 years ago, if the Bank of England or the British government could present the proposal of e-checks as an alternative, perhaps the opposition would not have been so strong. Well, the UK experience is not 100% relevant to us because at the outset, we have not thought about replacing paper checks with e-checks. We are just trying to present an additional option for Hong Kong people. Mr. Sin Chung Kai. Well, my time's up, right, Chairman? I have not put any time limit. Well, you have spoken for a long time already, Dr. En Chang. Mr. Sin Chung Kai. Perhaps I may not understand it too well. And you said that there is no e-check in the U.S., but I'm sure that there is a lot of electronic payment methods. I think there is something similar to e-checks in Hong Kong. Can you explain how they operate? They may not be doing it the same way as we are proposing. Now, if we want to launch e-checks in Hong Kong, both the payers bank and the payees bank should be well prepared. Are they prepared now? And will e-checks only be used for local operations and transfers and not cross-boundary or cross-border operations? Your first question has to do with the U.S. experience, whether they have something similar to our e-checks. Well, they are like us, 50%, or they issue paper checks and they take a photo of the paper check and then transmit it to the payee. So the paper check is in a way turned into an electronic image. But this is very different from what we are talking or proposing. We have full-fledged e-checks or e-check books. So what they're doing is very different from ours. Now, U.S. is also a common law jurisdiction, and there are a lot of litigations going on in the U.S. How come they accept what they are doing now and not what we are proposing? Can you make some comparisons on the pros and cons of the Hong Kong system vis-a-vis the U.S. system? We have made detailed comparisons. I think we our model is better off than the U.S. model in terms of our efficiency and security. Our assessment of why the U.S. is not launching a full-fledged e-check system is because it is difficult for them to get support from the banks in the U.S. to do that. For us, our question then is, do banks in Hong Kong support e-checks? Well, actually the idea was first floated by the banking sector itself. They believe that it can help save costs and provide better services to customers. "17 major retail banks, which have been issuing checks all along, will definitely implement the e-check initiative. And any bank which is now receiving paper check or is saying that they will accept e-checks. In other words, the banks which have been accepting paper checks said that they will definitely accept e-checks as well. So in other words, any bank in Hong Kong which is engaged in the check business will definitely accept e-checks. So that's the outcome of our discussion with the banking sector. And in fact, this very initiative was floated by the sector itself. What about cross-boundary checks? At the moment, we are just confining the scheme to local operations. But our view is that there is great potential for it to be extended to cross-boundary operations. So that's why I said that e-checks will help consolidate Hong Kong's status as an international financial hub. E-checks actually can go beyond boundaries, and if we have cross-boundary e-checks in the future, of course, we have to discuss with the other jurisdictions involved how they what's their view towards the legal aspects and so on. So what I can say is there is great potential for cross-boundary e-checks to be used. I can understand what you said. Can you give us something in writing to thresh out what you have just explained to us so that it can help members who are not here today to understand the situation? Several months ago, when you came to the panel, I asked this same question. And my question is, in your proposed operation, the payer should have a bank account. I believe that you would have already talked to all the stakeholders in this sector. And for the payee, you must have a bank account, a payee account. Now, with regard to the email or the bank account to be used by the payee, can he use all the bank accounts that he has, or is just one or two designated accounts? Should be an opt-in or opt-out options be provided? So how is it going to be like in terms of operation? Should the payee be asked every time when the e-check is issued, or is there a blanket opt-in, opt-out options? The email and the bank account are two different things, and they should be handled differently. Now, say if I'm the payee, the payer will ask me whether I am willing to accept e-check, and then I said yes, and then I provide him with the email address, and then the payer will issue the e-check to my email account. And for myself as a payee, I can choose which bank account to present my check to. Now, if I use e-banking, then I would deposit the check to my account on the e-banking.
電子支票咧存入我指定。
And then through the centralized presentment portal, I can deposit my check. So it's different from my account. Now, if I don't even know how to use the centralized presentment portal and I'd like to seek the assistance of my family members, we've also thought of that scenario. So the email address or account is only to receive the check only. The payor has to ask the payee for an email address for sending the check. So in that process, it is guaranteed that the payee accepts that form of payment. That's why we always mention that the payer has to affirm 2 points. First of all, the payee is willing to accept e-checks. Number 2, the payee has provided an email address such that the e-check can be transmitted. Well, when a payee receives an e-check on a particular email account or address, well, can you explain the operational details? The payee has to open his account and then deposit the check into the account. Is that correct? Can you show us some demonstrations? Now here you can see how e-checks operate. When the payee receives the check, he can deposit it into his collecting bank. If he's using e-banking services, he can open his e-banking account to deposit the e-check. Otherwise, he can make use of the centralized presentment portal for depositing the check. After the check has been deposited into the account, the clearance process will be the same as that for a traditional check. The HKICO is the intermediary. The paying bank will pay the collecting bank. In that process, basically, it's just like what's happening today. If we're using e-banking services, we can open our e-banking webpage. In future, there will be a function for depositing an e-check, so you can deposit your check. If he's not using e-banking, if he wants to use the portal is provided by the HKICL. This can be seen online. Throughout the whole process, you need not worry. It's just like a traditional check payable to a particular person. So basically, the account to which the check is paid must bear the same name as the check and the account. Otherwise, the check will be bounced. So in terms of security and efficiency, it will be better than now. Well, can you show us the chart for centralized presentment portal? Yes. Now, this is the operating model for depositing the check through the centralized presentment portal. At step 7, the bank does not go to the collecting bank, but to the portal provided by the HKICL. That is the centralized presentment portal. All right, Mr. Yu Si-wing. Mr. Chairman, our colleague would like to supplement. Well, members may be a bit confused. What is an e-check? It is just a PDF file. For our documents, we sometimes have PDF documents. So an e-check is a PDF electronic file. When you open it, it will show you an image. Why is it so safe? Because it is signed by the banks and the customer's digital signature. So if somebody changes $100 to $1,000 for Mr. Li Shupui, the check will immediately be bounced because such alterations can immediately be detected. So in future, fake checks will not appear at all. As for the electronic checkbook mentioned by Desmond, now here we provide mobile banking as well. Once you open your account, you can know that a check issued to Li Shu Poi, when it reaches the collecting bank or the issuing bank, any alteration can be detected. I attended many international conferences to talk about this, including the FBI. Including the Fed of the USA. At the moment, I don't need to give you my bank account before you can give me a check. But for electronic banking in Singapore, USA, etc., they're all looking at this. In particular, Singapore, they're particularly interested because they invest hugely in the banking sector. They see the merits of e-checks to banks and customers. So many major banks would like to try this out. So many jurisdictions are looking to us for experiments. Even for Malaysia, they're looking for possible cross-boundary collaboration, but they'll wait and see how effective Hong Kong's experience will be. Well, Mr. Yu Si-wing, I also use e-banking. Well, sometimes I cannot effect a transfer, otherwise I need to pay a transmission fee. And if there's no collecting account, we can't do that. But apparently, e-checks can solve the common problems for e-transfer. So I believe e-checks will be more convenient. Well, just now, we learned something about the centralized presentment portal. But if we don't go through that portal, we can have a direct transfer, right? So when will the payee collect the money? 2 days afterwards or what? Well, on the same day, interest will be paid, and on the same afternoon, the money can be transferred out of the payee account. Say if I owe the bank $100,000, if a check comes into my account, and each check comes into my account, immediately I can pay off the bank. But of course, you have to wait for the following day to transfer out the amount. Well, that's the merit of e-checks as well, because you can get the money immediately. Well, if you have money in your account, this is just an enhancement of e-transfer. Since it is an enhancement, why should you use the conventional method of transfer? Unless you need to go through the account of a third party, that is the centralized system. Can you resolve that as well? Don't stop it before the payee can receive the interest, because you're talking about enhancement. And now if you don't go through the centralized presentment portal, you need to have an affirmation of the email address. For traditional checks, we don't have that. We must go through the central clearance and settlement system before a paper check reaches the collecting bank, and you don't need to confirm an email address. Well, after this order is enacted, will the transfer of the e-check be legally binding? And is it also a legally binding transaction even in other jurisdictions? I'd like to thank the member for the question. At the moment, well, let me use this model to explain the situation. Now you go through the HKICL for confirmation. This is for e-checks as well as traditional checks, paper checks. That's why I said that interest would be calculated immediately, but you only get the interest in the afternoon. Just now the question was very good. Well, since we are going to have e-checks, can we get the money immediately? At the moment, we call them e-checks. E-checks are still checks, and checks are subject to the Bills of Exchange Ordinance. That is, to be regulated by the Bills of Exchange Ordinance. This payment too of e-checks, if is to enjoy the same legal status as traditional checks, then all modes of clearance, settlement, etc. should, as far as possible, follow those of traditional checks. After everything is all right, we'll see whether we can use other ways and means to make it even more expeditious in terms of payment is concerned. That is, we're looking at real-time crediting. In the process of development, we always remind ourselves that in order that e-checks become popular, their legal status must be the same as that of traditional checks, which have been in existence for a long, long time. So the clearance process, the settlement process, etc., follow exactly those for traditional checks. It's just that payment and collection are in electronic forms instead of in paper form. So we need an email address for the receipt of the check. It's just like for a traditional check, you need to provide a postal address. We don't rule out the possibility that in future we can look into this in more depth. That is, when e-checks are well established, then we can see whether we can further enhance them. For the process of enhancement, we don't just enhance e-checks but also traditional checks, because we are linking the two together. Otherwise, ordinary members of the public will find it difficult to accept e-checks, because for traditional checks, they are already under well-established regime in terms of bouncing, etc., etc. Anyway, both forms of checks will be regulated by the Bills of Exchange Ordinance. So in future, under this framework, we'll see how we can further enhance e-checks. Now, if I issue you with a check, when your bank receives my check, the check has to go through a clearing house, and the check has to be cleared physically. The pile of checks will have to be brought to the clearing house. But that is, you give them one night to confirm that there's money in the paying account. But for e-checks, there's real-time clearance with the clearing house, right? And the money can be transferred immediately. If I give you $10,000, I can write you a check. Tomorrow, you only debit me $10,000 tomorrow, right? No, at the moment, it's on the same night. Yes, on the same night, but for me, the $10,000 is still there. But for e-checks, you can debit me in real time, that is instantly. I give you the e-check at 9 a.m. Upon receiving the check, which is emailed to you, in just a few minutes' time, you can cash the check. But for physical checks, you need a tendering process, right? Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your question and analysis, which are correct. At the moment, for traditional checks or for future electronic checks, the clearance time required is not directly related to the form of transmission. Checks themselves are debit transfer instruments. So the paying bank has to check the account of the customer, whether or not he has got money in the bank account. the bank has to verify the signature as well. So insofar as the bank is concerned, it has to do all these on the same night, not during business hours. Otherwise, the demand on manpower would be excessive. So for checks, the most expeditious way is to deposit the check today and collect the money tomorrow. We have to provide good services to customers as far as possible, so we tell the banks to calculate the interest today, that is on the same day. So for the payee, the quickest time to get the money is the following day, because the bank has to do clearance and verify the signature.
Fair.
This is somehow different from other types of transfer. Well, the payer will issue a check, and then the paying bank has to give out the money. And the paying bank has to confirm that the payer does have the money and the signature is right, and that takes time. Now, let me say this again. I give you $10,000, but my bank account has only $1,000. Is it the case that the paying bank will not allow to issue a check of $10,000? Now, we have to look at the interface between the paper checks and the e-checks. Now, there are very often cases where when when a check is issued, then the payer might not have the adequate amount in his bank account to pay the money, but then afterwards he deposits a sufficient amount of money and into the bank account, and we can't request the issuing of the e-check in the future to do something different, because we want to be consistent in our approach towards paper checks and e-checks. Mr. Ng Lang Sing. Now, the government wants to launch the e-check system, but then it is afraid of shouldering extra risk in relating to the operation. Now, you have this channel to channel the money to the collecting bank. Can you amend the legislation so that the payee doesn't have to wait for an extra day? You are not doing that because you are afraid of shouldering the extra risk. But what you are proposing is electronic transfer of money. So can the government consider doing it at one go, i.e., giving the money out immediately? You said that there may be legal liability in doing that. But then you are not going down the way I propose. So you would be queried in the future that it's just another form of electronic payment. Now, if you are going by your approach, I suggest that you go by the second proposal instead of the approach adopted in the upper diagram. I don't know who is to query you in the future. Now, people will say that you are just doing electronic transfer of money. I don't think you have thought this out too meticulously. The second question is related to confirmation by email. The payee has to confirm that of his receipt of the payer's email. And I think that should be done, right? The payee has to confirm that he has received the email from payer. Is that the case? Well, all the payer needs to do is to provide the email address, and the payer doesn't have to confirm the receipt of the email. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, member, for your question. Electronic transfer and e-checks. What is the difference between the two? Well, the difference lies not in whether it is paper-based or electronic-based. Electronic transfer is a kind of credit transfer. And from the payer's account, money is transferred to the payee's account. So electronic transfer, because of that, enable money to be paid out immediately. But then checks are subject to the Bills of Exchange Ordinance. And e-checks and paper checks are not credit transfer, but rather debit transfer. Now, what is debit transfer? The payee receives a payment instrument, and through the banking system, he takes this instrument to the system and get the money from the payer. So the debit transfer is just exactly the opposite of credit transfer. So all along, credit transfer can allow money to be paid immediately. But for debit transfer, using checks, the earliest time that you can get money is the following day, because banks have to verify the payer's signature and whether there is enough money in his bank account or balance in his bank account. Now, in Hong Kong's banking sector, electronic transfer has been existing for a long time, where money is paid out immediately, but then checks do have their own merits. The beauty of it is that I don't have to tell the payer which bank account that I'm depositing my check into, so I don't have to tell the other side the details of my bank account. So the banks do have its own merit, and checks do have its own merit, and every day there are some hundreds of thousands of checks being issued. So what we are talking about is to enhance the efficiency of check and the security of checks, which is a kind of debit transfer. So that's why we proposed the idea of e-checks. E-checks can be used locally, and there is a great potential for them to be used overseas. There is one more thing. In Hong Kong's banking sector now, there are several millions of bank account holders who do not live in Hong Kong. And if we have e-checks in the future, it will make it more convenient for them to use their bank accounts in Hong Kong, because they don't have to receive physical checkbooks in Hong Kong. So we are trying to enhance the check system in Hong Kong and make it more and help bring greater benefits to the development of Hong Kong's financial sector. So I think we can consider in the future how to enhance the settlement system further. And if we do that in the future, then we would take into consideration both the e-checks and the paper checks, because the e-checks and the paper checks all belong to the same framework. So I hope that I have explained myself clearly. Mr. Ng Lang Sing. Now, if there are unhonored e-checks in the future, will the same treatment be given to them as what we're doing in paper checks? Yes. Now, if my question has been raised before, just give me a brief answer, and that's acceptable. As a member of this sector, I welcome any new technology which can help enhance the functions of the check system, which has a long history. Mr. UC Wing is sort of misled because he talks about electronic transfer, and we are not talking about electronic transfer. We are talking about e-checks. They're just like e-air tickets now. So if we look at it from that angle, then it's more easily acceptable by the public. I have 3 questions. We are a pioneer, as you said. We are leading in terms of launching e-checks in the world. I think it's good. And we will give the others the impression that we are a pioneer, but then there is a risk therein. And we have to go by trial and error. So I would like to ask how much efficiency can be enhanced through this system. We may be talking about savings in time and money. Would you be assessing the efficiency to be achieved? So what's the efficiency enhancement? In terms of cost, are we paying more or less? And in terms of manpower, we will be saving up on manpower as well. And if that is the case, would it have an impact on manpower distribution in the sector? Because people may worry their jobs, they will lose jobs. Second question is about market share. And we would be having half of the checks issued as e-checks and half as paper checks. So what will be the trend in the future? We are adopting technology to replace manpower here. Third question. In paragraph 15, before the e-check was launched, at the end of this year, there will be promotion activities. Well, why that late? From now on till the end of this year, we have 10 more months to go. So why are we waiting for 10 months before we launch publicity activities? We're discussing this now at the beginning of the year. For the banks and the bank customers, if we can do publicity earlier, then I think we would achieve better effect. And it would be conducive to people's acceptance and use of e-checks. Now, if you are doing publicity that late, you would be giving people the impression that there are still a number of deadlocks to be resolved. And we are just worried that ultimately you won't be able to launch the system at all. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, member, for your questions. Saving of manpower and also the impact on the cost. Let me cite some figures which came from our surveys. Paper checks. For each paper check, $15 is spent in handling it by the bank. And this is a variable cost, not a fixed cost. So for every additional check to be treated or handled, an extra $15 is involved or incurred, and there is also an inflation and so on. And we need a large storage space to store checks. And $1.7 billion is spent every year by the banking sector in dealing or handling checks.
咁取代呢個紙張。
It's not that e-checks will fully replace paper checks, but once a paper check is replaced, there'll be a saving of $10. Hong Kong's monetary sector is developing very rapidly. Banks won't be cutting on manpower. Rather, manpower can be deployed to areas to provide better services and to areas where banks can make more profits. As for market share, will it be in the ratio of 50-50? Paper checks will gradually be changed to e-checks. But we're not just talking about Hong Kong dollar checks. Renminbi checks are also developing very rapidly. Every day we have around 500,000 Hong Kong dollar checks. Now for renminbi checks, just a few thousand, not reaching 10,000 yet. But when renminbi checks become more common as a form of payment, renminbi checks may also grow very fast in numbers. And then after launching e-checks, some new checks may be in the form of e-checks. In passing, I'd like to say that for the settlement system for renminbi checks, last month is 880 billion renminbi daily. For Hong Kong dollar is around 500 to 600 billion dollars, Hong Kong dollars. Therefore, in terms of renminbi checks, now we only have a few thousand per day, but in future that number may grow very rapidly. So it's opportune for us to launch e-checks. What about other currencies? US dollar? Also a few thousand per day, like renminbi checks. You can also use e-checks in future for US dollar checks. What about cost? The use of e-checks, when compared of the use of ordinary checks, of course, banks can save a lot by launching e-checks. But what about the development cost? To the ordinary public, if they use e-checks, well, you have to understand the banks. Have you got any undertakings from the banks in terms of fees and charges? And then to members of the public, how will they benefit in money terms? Well, thank you very much, Chairman, for your question and analysis. We did talk to the banking industry. The development of e-checks and traditional checks is the same in terms of development cost. So e-checks won't add to the burden of consumers. Why should we launch this only at the end of this year? Well, in fact, we will launch a pilot program first. At the end of the year, we will start publicity in the middle of the year. So the pilot scheme will last 3 months from December this year to February next year. We, of course, want everything to proceed smoothly. Then in March next year, we can have a full launch. So the pilot program will start at the end of this year, but the education programs will start in the middle of this year. All right, so the actual education program will start in the middle of this year. We would like to have an early start. You mentioned that we have fewer renminbi checks now, but if there's convenience, more e-checks will be used. Here, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the banking industry. At the same time, we don't want to see enhanced regulation as a result of the launching of e-checks. That is, we don't want to see more regulatory requirements. Say banks will need to report more details data, etc. to you. Because to a bank, once you have more types of products, more work will be generated. So the banking industry is already heavily burdened. So with the launch of this new product, we only want appropriate regulatory requirements. Well, Dr. Chang, well, how many percentage of the consumers of Hong Kong are using traditional checks? And after the launching of e-checks, how many more customers will be using checks according to your estimation? And in what areas will e-checks be applied according to your estimation? Millions of customers are using e-banking. Last time we learned that the figure stood at 9 million. That is 9 million e-banking customers. After launching e-checks, we should get more, but probably not too much more. Because at the moment, Hong Kong only has a population of 7 million people, and we already have 9 million e-banking accounts. But of course, for these 9 million e-banking accounts, maybe one person owns a few e-banking accounts. In fact, the figure grows from year to year. A few years ago, the figure stood at 2 million only, and now it has grown to 9 million. There will be a further growth, but it is difficult to tell how much of that growth would be due to the launch of e-checks. Well, I have doubts about those figures. For e-banking, at the moment, if you open a new account, you'll be asked to open an e-banking account as well. But how many e-banking accounts are actually active, that is, with transactions? Well, we only counted the accounts, the number of accounts opened. We don't have a special figure for active e-banking accounts, that is, accounts with transactions. Well, we observed that most of the accounts are very active. We can give you the figure later. Well, were e-banking accounts mostly used for the payment of electricity and water tariffs, for example? Well, from what we could observe, the business sector will use e-checks more in future for ordering goods, for example. Well, will it be a comprehensive launch? B2B first before B2C, or are you going to cover both? Well, it's up to you to choose. Well, if you don't accept e-checks, you can just tell the other party that you would like to keep to traditional checks. It's for the individual to choose. You won't be forced to use e-checks. So it will be a comprehensive launch. Well, if you're willing to accept an e-check, by all means do so. Otherwise, just accept traditional checks. Well, that leads to another question. I can see two issues here. Well, you have to seek the consent of the payee. If the payee does not consent, then the payor, well, the payee has to inform the payor to cancel the check, and then the payer will have to ask the bank to stop payment for that e-check. Well, need that be so complicated? Thank you, Chairman. I'd also like to thank Dr. Chang for her question. Now, when an e-check is issued, the payor has to seek the consent of the payee and obtain the payee's email address before sending an e-check. I believe 99.9% of the cases, in terms of the payee, will deposit the e-check immediately. But in a small number of cases, the payer might have obtained consent from the payee and has obtained the payee's email account. But when the payee receives the e-check, he changes his mind and doesn't want it. Then he'll have to inform the payer, and the payer will inform the payment bank, the paying bank, to cancel the e-check. Well, maybe for special reasons, the payee does not want to accept an e-check. I say, if Mr. Andrew Leung send me an e-check for $1 million, well, of course, quickly pocket that e-check. Before Mr. Andrew Leung sends the e-check to me, does he have to obtain my electronic reply that I am willing to accept an e-check? Because all along he knows my email account. Well, that's not necessary. He only needs to obtain your verbal consent that you agree to accept an e-check. And then he only needs to confirm with you that the email address is correct before he sends you the e-check. Well, just now I mentioned a scenario. That is for IPOs. For an IPO, usually the payee has to, on paper or electronically, confirm that he's going to accept a check or electronic transfer. Between individuals, you don't need to do this in black and white. You only need a verbal agreement. Well, just now, it sounded very complicated because you may need to stop payment. But you see, sometimes the payee may renege on his previous consent, so a traditional check will have to be sent instead. Well, may I refer you to the schedule of the order? You are going to repeal Section 13, right? That is, e-checks are no longer transferable. Is that what you mean? Well, just by looking at this, it may sound complicated. Number one, we have to understand that we are to amend Schedule 1. Schedule 1 says that no instruments, no negotiable instruments can be done electronically. But here we have to take out checks such that they can be done electronically. But still, there are two major categories that electronic transfer won't be allowed. Cash checks are one of the category. Only demand notes and cross checks can be processed electronically. So here, we just take out cross checks and demand notes. And other instruments similar to checks can be processed electronically. So, Mr. Chairman, to sum up, I very much appreciate the administration's effort in considering new, environment-friendly and convenient means of transfer for the public. Some other bureaus have been very old-fashioned and stubborn. So the most important point is security. I have no other questions. Mr. Sin Chung Kai? Well, this may be very simple. When you issue an e-check, the bank needs to know that you have issued a check. As this is a check, the bank has no right to freeze your check up till the time of clearance, as is now. And just now, one of your colleagues said that this is just like a PDF file. But even for PDF files, there can be different versions. In your banks, will you have standards what will be the impact of different versions of the PDF file? The first question is whether or not the amount of money would be frozen. The answer is no. Debit will only be affected at the time of clearance. As for file versions, I'll defer to Mr. Li Shupui. Well, the banks will use the latest version, and this will be standardized throughout the whole banking industry. We are still in the development stage.
We understand that the sector will always use the latest version, and the whole sector will use the same version. It will not be the case that one bank uses one version and the other version. This is exactly what I am worried about, because PDF have new versions every now and then, and how are you going to do the upgrading in the future? For example, the banking sector may agree on, say, a version 10 point something, and then banks may adopt them at the later versions at different times. But banks have to adopt the same standard, because a check is issued by one bank and is accepted by another. So there should be a working group within the sector to agree on which version to adopt. We are now in a development stage, and we understand very well that we should have a common standard. But this should be going beyond the legislation, right? So how are you going to make sure that the same standard is used? Well, the HKMA will monitor it. And also at the clearinghouse, there are certain regulations governing certain aspects of the bank's activities, or else they will be subject to a penalty. The banks have a common goal to develop this, so I'm sure that they will have a common standard. But you cannot assume that the technology standards of the banks are the same. Different banks are the same, and some banks may adopt certain versions, and the other banks may not adopt that version. So the range can be very wide. So what will happen? Can you do it this way at the clearinghouse? Can you do something among banks? Thank you, Chairman, for your question. Yes, we can do that. Through the HKICL, well, the banks interact with each other under different regulations. And there have been many regulations drawn up already, and PDF will be one of the areas subject to regulation in the future. For example, cross-boundary SWIFT, and also the local clearing system, and also the e-checks in the future, and also the present traditional check clearing system. There are already existing regulations which are drawn up by the sector itself. And they do know that they must work on something common, because they are both the paying bank and also the payee banks. So this is something of great concern to us, and also the HKICL regularly updates the system and makes enhancements. And it will not be the case that some banks are using certain standards and others are using other standards. I think this may be the common wish of the banks, but then when there is a dispute, is there any authority which can specify the standards? We do now have a clearing and settlement ordinance, systems ordinance, and we govern various clearance systems on euros and bonds and so on. So under that ordinance, i.e. the Clearance and Settlement Systems Ordinance, there are certain regulations and rules. And banks participating in the system which have to upgrade their standards. They have certain guidelines and common rules to adhere to. I mean, this is a system that has been in place for the past 10 to 20 years, and there will not be any problems, we believe. We will continue monitoring and regulating the settlement and clearance system as in the past, and we would continuously update the systems and make enhancements as necessary. So this is what we have been doing all along. Well, that may be the case, but can you tell me that is it the case that the HKMA under this Clearance and Settlement Systems Ordinance set certain standards? Yes, that's the case. For any changes to be made by the sector, they have to be approved by us. Now, if there is any latest development in the international arena, then it may be the HKMA which sort of pushes the new initiatives. And there may be initiatives coming from the sector. But anyway, all these need the approval of the HKMA. I have another question, Chairman, about the payee refusing to accept e-checks. Now, you said that verbal consent is good enough, but, well, that's difficult to prove because you will not be, say, tape recording your conversation with a friend. And perhaps after I have lunch with you, then in the afternoon, I get an e-check from you. Now, you said that I have the right to refuse to accept an e-check. So when can I refuse? Will I be forced to accept an e-check? I may refuse to accept an e-check, or I may not deposit an e-check out. How are these two scenarios different? They are different. If you request stop payment, that means the payer has to give you the payment through another avenue, for example, through a traditional check or another types of transfer, or give you cash. But if you don't stop payment, if you don't have stop payment, then it's just like you are not depositing a check. Just in the case if you don't deposit a traditional check. I have a follow-up question then. For the BPA, you represent the SMEs, and the SMEs may receive a batch of e-checks, and that's all right for them. But for the average citizen, he may receive an e-check, and he may get scared. So what should he do? Well, he can stop payment. And if he doesn't really want to receive e-checks, and he dare not use the centralized presentment portal, well, he can ask his family members to deposit a check for him. And he doesn't have to be worried at all because he is named as the payee or the bearer in the check. So he doesn't have to be worried, and he can ask the family members to deposit a check for him. Can a payee just take the e-check to a bank and ask the bank to handle that check for him? Well, no, I don't think so. You can't do that. For the counter at the bank, well, it cannot deal with the e-check. But we've talked to the banks, and if a customer presents an e-check to the counter, then the counter staff can teach him what to do. And the counter staff can give advice to the customer, and the counter staff will not just ask the customer to go away without offering any help. E-checks are a service of the e-banking service, so the bank counter cannot help you deposit this e-check, but what it can do is to give you advice on what to do with the e-check. Now, if a person doesn't have an e-banking account, and he may receive an e-check, and he may get scared. Let me try to give you an example. For example, if one day I receive an e-check, and I look through my mobile phone, and there is this e-check. I don't have an e-banking account, and I don't use a computer. And what I can do is I can go to a bank, talk to the counter staff, and in the initial stage, the counter staff can use the computer at the bank or the customer's mobile phone to go to the centralized presentment portal and deposit his check there. And the counter staff can teach the customer what to do. And the customer can also take his family member to go to the bank together with him and deal with the check together. And if he can just upload the check onto the portal, that means that he has already deposited the check with his bank account. Is there any problem with the portal being identified? Well, the portal is still being developed. Dr. Zhang. So that's why I suggest that you perhaps should proceed with B2B and B2C first. B2C is a good thing, but somehow is something new, and a lot of problems are bound to arise. People may not be familiar with e-banking services, and banks are now committing a lot of resources into e-banking, and they will try to save up on other fronts. So they hope that more customers can use e-checks. So banks would be encouraging their customers to use e-checks, and chaos may result. So I'm worried about that. To our understanding, there are a lot of Internet activities going on, which are subject to attacks by hackers. And people may worry that their e-checks may be hacked, and their check numbers may be exposed, and so on. Well, the hackers will usually hack into the websites of big companies and not individuals' websites. And if there is hacking, I think the responsibility would be lying with the banks rather than the individuals themselves. Dr. An Jiang, thank you for your question. Should we be just confining e-checks to B2B? Well, we have considered that before, but if we adopt that approach, then it will impede on the use of e-checks. why are checks so popular? It's because they can be issued by companies and individuals alike. In the mainland, checks are not popular at all because on the mainland only companies can issue checks and not individuals. So checks are not a common payment method.
應該鼓勵啊，咁呢啲係另一。
You may ask me, should we encourage checks? Well, that's quite another subject. We won't discuss it here. If we confine e-checks to B2B transfers, we'll be suffocating the development of e-checks. For new things, at the beginning of launching, if we hinder its development, then in future, the development will also be hindered. There's another issue, that is hacking. As we have this public key infrastructure, PKI, it is absolutely impossible to change the particulars on the check. So even if you get the check, it will be useless because you can't change the particulars on the check. If you ask me, will there be anybody who would very much like to hack the system without getting a check, the particulars of which he can change? I think that's quite unlikely because under the PKI system, basically it's impossible to change the particulars on the check. And we can also have multi-tier encryption as well. Well, just now we discussed a lot about an individual receiving an e-check. What should happen? Just now my colleague Mr. Lee Shupui already explained that if the payee really feels helpless, he doesn't have an e-banking account, he does not know how to go online to use the centralized portal, he can still go to the bank to ask the bank staff to help him deposit the e-check into his account. So we'll be taking care of all scenarios where you go to the bank, but you're not depositing the check at a counter like what you're doing now. It's just that the bank will deposit the e-check into your account. So we'll be taking care of all scenarios. Well, the counter staff, that is the teller, can deposit the e-check into the centralized presentment portal if the payee does not have any account and does not have any e-banking account. So unless the payee doesn't want to accept any check into his account, but that shouldn't be the case because we now have traditional checks already. We have to go back to the House Committee on the 9th of January. Deadline for CSAs, 14th of January. And then we have to move the motion for the amendment on the 21st of January. So if we can't finish our discussion today, we have to call another meeting on the 6th of January. Any more extension? No, no more. No more. The Hong Kong MA has already handled all your questions. Of course, you can ask questions again, but if we can't finish today, we'll have to take the time slot at 2:30 p.m. on the 6th of January. Well, if I issue an e-check to the payee, is it that the check will automatically be supported by sufficient money? Well, no, it's the same as the existing system for traditional checks. Oh, but what if the check cannot be honored? Oh, you have to be held liable legally then, just like now. So what will be the greatest liability insofar as the public is concerned? It's just like that for traditional checks. If a check cannot be honored, then it will be a criminal offense. And nowadays, usually something like a fixed penalty will be handed down by the court. That's why we have to pick e-checks to traditional checks, because for traditional checks, we already have the framework. For bounced checks or checks not honored, a penalty system is already there. So the same will apply for e-checks. Mr. Sin Chung Kai, Mr. Chairman, I believe we need another meeting. It doesn't matter. Well, I will be available on the afternoon of the 6th of January. Say if I have an e-banking account, I've issued an e-check. At the moment, many people don't have an e-cert. And many people don't use an e-cert to open an e-banking account. So when you issue an e-check, do you need an e-cert? Yes, you need an e-cert. Well, I believe company-issued checks will be all right. They're rather common. But what about checks issued by individuals? Thank you, Chairman. For the individuals, some individuals already have e-certs. Even if they don't, the bank will apply for e-certs for their customers. And the e-cert is for online banking and e-checks. So to promote automation throughout our society and to promote online services, that will be very helpful. So by that time, you consider this. If a bank wants to promote e-checks, it will help customers to obtain e-certs. Well, Mr. Chairman, I hope that they can go back and work on the following questions and then come back to us. Now, for electronic images, how does the U.S. compare with us? I'd like to have a supplementary paper on the issues that you've considered. And then for technical standards and their legal basis, where will your power come from? Please give us a clear paper. Now you say that banks will agree, but what if banks do not agree in future? Who will have the final say? And then if an individual receives an e-check and doesn't know what to do, how many options will he have? Please also give us a supplementary paper. And then Mr. U.C. Wing mentioned a piece of legislation that regulates non-real-time payment and its legal basis. I understand that you want to equate e-checks with traditional checks. That's why when you deposit the check today, real payment will only be effected tomorrow. So I'd like to have all the details documented next time. The assistant of Mr. Charles Mock also passed on a series of questions to the administration. So I hope the government will respond to all those questions next time. May we proceed to clause-by-clause scrutiny? Who will lead us? Joey? The first article is that we hope the order can come into operation on the 1st of April. So when e-checks are launched in December this year, we'll have a suitable piece of legislation to support it. Any questions? No? Section 2 then, to amend the Electronic Transactions Ordinance. Section 3, the amendment itself. As I said, Schedule 1 should be amended. If we are to launch e-checks, then we have to repeal Section 13 by adding something in the bracket. Negotiable instruments, but excluding checks that bear the words not negotiable. That is cross-checks and promissory notes from banks, which will in future be handled electronically as well. And cash checks won't be transacted electronically. Mr. Chairman, do we have a Chinese version for not negotiable? Do we have a Chinese version for not negotiable? Well, we translate not negotiable as, well, maybe we should defer to our legal advisor. Legal advisor of Village School. Sorry, the speaker's not coming through. Concerning Mr. Sin's question of whether there's a Chinese version. Well, the English version follows the Bills of Exchange Ordinance, so we should follow the terminology closely under that ordinance. So even for paper checks, the version not negotiable is used, even in the Chinese version. So insofar as as far as I understand, in future, the same version, not negotiable, will be used in the Chinese version. Well, we don't have a Chinese version even now. Even now, in the Chinese version, an English expression is used. We won't use 不可流轉的支票 in the Chinese version. That's my understanding. That is, the English expression will be used in the Chinese version. Well, I may be naive. Usually our checks are bilingual. Usually our checkbooks are also bilingual. So if I'm to write not negotiable, I can't write it in Chinese. I must write it in English. Is that correct? Yes. Well, I don't know whether our colleagues can supplement. At the moment, not negotiable is written in English, even in the Chinese version at the moment. Hong Kong MA, well, there are two categories. For the crossed checks, there's a chop, not negotiable. And then another category is or bearer. And then when issuing a check, the issuer will cross out the words or bearer, changing it to not negotiable. So either you use a chop and write non-negotiable, or you cross out or bearer. So even now, in the Chinese version, not negotiable is used. Yes, no Chinese version for not negotiable. So much for clause-by-clause scrutiny. Mr. Sin, do you have any question? Not for the time being. Do we need another meeting? They're going to submit written responses. Well, I think for the time being, we should assume that there's another meeting. Well, now is Friday. Today is Friday. Tuesday is the deadline. Well, administration, when will you be able to give us your responses? We've already got your questions. We can act immediately. Well, we can send you a reply on Monday. Then we'll ask our colleagues whether we need another meeting. Well, if you can give me the answers before close of play, I can do. Well, what do you mean by close of play? You mean the 5th of January? All right, close of play on the 5th of January. As for consultation, I don't think we have any more time for public consultation. All right, so we won't do that. Any other business? I don't have AOB here, so meeting adjourned.